So, Song of Saya or Saya no Uta is this visual novel. You might have heard of it. It's a horror story, though maybe not a traditional one. It was released in 2003 and was penned by Gen Urobuchi of Madoka and Fate Zero fame, who is heavily inspired by the works of Lovecraft. It creates an incredible atmosphere of tension, discomfort, and even revulsion through the way it creates sympathy for a protagonist who is maybe the worst person ever. It's one of my favourites and has amassed a bit of a cult following, although I think these days people know it more from some plushie. Anyway, so why was there a bizarre American comic adaptation in 2010? Yes, published by IDW and starting in February of 2010. Years before any official English version of the game, this perhaps ill-fated adaptation set out to tell a version of this horror tale in just 3 issues. Now, I've heard a little about this comic and its differences to the game, with one bizarre choice in particular being practically the only thing I knew going in, but I decided to give it a fair chance. After all, I can be a fan of unorthodox adaptations. Well, that was certainly something. First, while it's easy to criticize an adaptation for being different, and believe me, there are valid criticisms of this comic, we will get there are genuinely things to like here. I quite like the style of the background art. The distinct outlines with hazy colors underneath blurs everything together in a way that feels dreamlike, befitting for our protagonist's loose grip on reality as he fades in and out of delusion, never quite sure if what he's seeing is the real world. Background characters especially blur into the background like an amorphous mass, appropriate for the inhuman creatures that Josh sees them as. The protagonist in this version is called Josh, we will get there. There's this really neat effect I noticed, where the borders around the panel of the comic itself change depending on whether you're looking at is real or fake. They start out organized and regular, flitting between this state and a scrawled, disheveled mess as we come in and out of delusion, before fully devolving into borders of flesh and meat in the final issue. Okay, I know it sounds like I'm grasping at straws to find good things in this, like the borders between the panels, but I genuinely care about this stuff. I really like when adaptations of a work to a new medium properly utilize the unique aspects of that new medium to influence the storytelling. Speaking of flesh and meat, some of the distorted shapes and people that Josh sees are great and genuinely a little unsettling to look at. The panel where he wakes up from his surgery and sees them for the first time is great. These twisted but recognizably human-ish things surrounding him and looking straight at him. Their faces made of what can only be described as meat. Just great. Just in general, some of these delusion sequences are great, really twisting the world into something just barely almost recognizable as real, but turned raw and alien. This one page from the final issue is great for this, as it has a similar layout to some background art from the VN, so the difference in style is really clear. Overall, I do prefer the overly real style of the VN, with its CG-assisted visuals adding a gross uncanniness and depth to the scene, but I still really like the comic's hazy, less focused, almost impressionistic style. Okay, that's enough of the good for now. Before we get into things, I gotta throw out there that the game we're talking about here has objectionable content of just about every variety, so no judgment if you don't want to deal with that. That said, the version of the VN I'll be discussing is the Steam release. Yeah, it's an edited version of the script with some content removed, but you're not really missing anything. I just don't personally think the extended scenes do much for the prose and kinda take away from the atmosphere. But also it's just less of a risk for YouTube. What this comic is really known for is the liberties it takes with the visual novel story and themes. The VN is proper creeping horror, the fear is of what you don't know. It throws you straight into the deep end for its very first scene, putting you right in Fuminori, the protagonist's head, as he navigates a social encounter, only able to see his friends as fleshy, gurgling monsters. The first-person narration sets the tone very effectively, and at times you can feel yourself sympathizing, even empathizing with him, even as he spirals into madness. All alone in this world so fundamentally incompatible with the human psyche. Well, almost all alone. As the story progresses, it delves further into cosmic horror, quickly conveying that Fuminori's companion, Saya, is something else. But as you learn trickles of information about her and cracks of her true nature start to show, you understand that she could be something much more terrible than the world inside Fuminori's head. Which is truly worse, the fear of not knowing, or the terror of knowing? If you were to find out, really know about the things your mortal mind can't comprehend, would you be able to go back to your normal life? If there is information that is dangerous to your mind, things that simply should never be known, would you keep your humanity if one of these unknowable things is right by your side? But most importantly, while it seeds all these questions in your mind, it never outright answers them. It gives you just enough information to keep you wondering, but by not giving you a conclusive answer, it never gives your mind the satisfaction and closure of knowing. Importantly, you never truly see Saya in the visual novel. You see Fuminori's romanticized and pure view of her, and during the brief sections from other characters' perspectives, you may see their disbelieving, wordless reaction to her unfathomable form. But beyond the general idea of meat and tentacles, you're totally left to imagine her for yourself. So remember I said the comic's protagonist's name is Josh? Yeah, the most immediately noticeable change is that for some reason or another, almost every single character in this comic has been renamed. I say renamed, but it's more like they've been completely replaced with new characters with only surface-level similarities to their originals. Like they fulfill the same general role, but they're just not remotely the same people. Of course, there's one character who keeps their name, kinda hard not to when it's in the title. And yeah, she's kind of the core of the story and her name is a major part of the story's identity, like it's right there. But it still feels a little odd that the one character who keeps their Japanese name is the mysterious alien who seduces the protagonist with her pure and dubiously innocent charms. Yeah. And yeah, I know I'm probably reading too far into something that isn't there, but as you're going to find out, there isn't much else to read into at all, so the mind does wander. Even beyond the characters, this comic's version of even the basic story of Song of Saya is wildly different. To say it takes liberties is an understatement, and while it starts similarly, though with some marked differences, by the last of the 3 issues the plot has gone completely off the rails from the original, with only some superficial resemblance, turning a slow and creeping and intimate cosmic horror story about the monster you don't see into a bland and tired conspiracy about a dumb scientist masterminding a scheme to do something I don't even know. Some would even go as far as to say that it entirely misunderstands and misrepresents the original work. I think there's legitimacy to that thought, and nothing makes that more apparent than the ending of the first issue. The first issue takes us through 30-ish pages of serviceable mystery, weird-looking faces, is that Adam Sandler? And some honestly great gory imagery of Josh's hallucinations. Like, it's so fleshy and squishy and ligamenty, and I really like how it only affects the details of people's faces on this one page. Like, the hard edges of their heads are there, but the facial features are turned into out-of-focus gory blurs. Like Josh's brain is fudging the details of them into something worse. Or sometimes their faces are mostly right, but there's something wrong. Skin starting to shift and melt into vague tendrils, and the way it's drawn makes it really feel like the work of a malfunctioning brain trying to piece together an image from eyes that aren't plugged in right. A machine just trying its best to function as normal despite the damage. Anyway, at the end of this first issue, Josh, isolated from everyone due to his worsening hallucinations, ends up seeking comfort in the only person he can perceive as normal, the only person that makes him feel normal, Saya. This is close enough to the events of the visual novel, but with a significant, crucial difference that sums up the issues of this comic's interpretation of the story. You can see her. One of the best parts of how the original game builds its atmosphere is that it never quite shows you what Saya actually is. You build up an idea of what she is as the story unfolds, but it keeps you just enough in the dark that your own imagination is much more unsettling than what she actually is could ever be. But in the comic there is no tension, no mystery, no nagging questions on your mind of what she is, no second guessing yourself debating whether or not she deliberately plays the character of a sweet young girl. No, you straight up see her. Her true form is not only visible, the comic feels proud enough of it to use it as the cliffhanger, presented as a whole-page illustration, and a pretty metal one at that. In any other context, this could be pretty cool, but here it's like the comic is pridefully displaying its total lack of care and attention to the source material. It totally changes the genre from horror to a not great thriller. Like, this isn't scary, it's just a monster, you know? It's not necessarily a bad thing, there's nothing wrong with the thriller. It's just that in this instance, what does that thriller have to gain by being attached to Song of Saya? This unfortunately sets the tone for the rest of the comic to come. I said leading into this that I can be a fan of unorthodox adaptations, but I clearly don't like this, and I think the difference is that a good but different adaptation of a work understands the original well, knows what it's about and what it's trying to say, but is aware of the difference in medium, and so makes necessary changes to convey the same ideas and feeling as the original, but in a new medium. Heck, I even think in a lot of cases, a direct, faithful adaptation is a waste of time. Trying to fit one medium's sensibilities into another's format without actually doing anything new with it, like, what's the point? The original isn't going anywhere. This comic, while yeah, it's different to the visual novel, doesn't display that necessary understanding of the original work, so its reinterpretations feel more like errors. It really is like the name is attached to a mostly unrelated story that's simply worse. Like I said, it quickly totally diverges from the original, but to be honest, I think it's making inferior story decisions from the beginning. The visual novel throws you straight in. In Medias Res is the name of the game, and after the brief false warmth of the really quite peaceful and serene menu, the music here is very fittingly titled Sabbath. The very first scene is this disorienting conversation, months after Fuminori's accident. A routine meeting with the people he used to see as his friends, who are now just indescribable sacks of flesh to him. Everything about this, the grotesque visuals, the sound design, the messed up text display for everyone but Fuminori, serves to create this great sense of isolation and immediately places you in his shoes. Seriously, that sound design, those garbled voice lines are so gross and suffocating, and the way they're the first thing you hear mixed in with the growling bass and screaming guitar of the soundtrack is such a drop right into the deep end. Yeah, you're missing the context for how he came to be this way and how his relationships with these people used to be, but I think it's just more effective this way. You get the explanation through a guided flashback later on anyway, but missing context is pretty appropriate for Fuminori's mental state at this point in the story. It's been so long for him that he's barely able to recognize his visions as the people they really are. If it wasn't for Saya, he would have totally lost himself already, and this is the beginning of the story. You're thrown into the thick of it straight away, and it only gets worse for Fuminori's mental state from here. Combine that with the first-person narrative style of a visual novel, almost all of it coming from Fuminori's broken perspective, and you really find yourself sympathizing with him even as he descends into true madness. It's like a horror story from the perspective of the monster. It's really good at using the unique elements of the visual novel presentation as a vehicle for its isolating storytelling, and I think this just inherently makes it difficult, though not impossible, to translate into another medium. That said, I think the comic adaptation is actually worse than this implies. The comic derails completely from the original story in its back half, adding conflict through an antagonistic faction of essentially mad scientists. This is such a step down, I don't even know where to begin. One of the VN's main strengths is how it makes you question what a villain really is, and whether there really are any to be found. But here we have a gang of mustache-twirling doctors with hired goons and secret facilities concocting a secret plan to do whatever. I think the reason for this change is to create the same sense of sympathy for the protagonist, where the difference in format makes it harder to do inherently through monologue, but this might be giving the comic's creation process too much credit. More on that later. The issue, well, one of them, is that by having these cartoonishly evil villains, all the subtlety and ambiguity of morals is gone. Josh is the good guy, and there really isn't room for debate on it. He was deliberately operated on and his brain wired to pick up on Saya's frequencies. Yeah, they try to come up with a scientific reason for it all. Yeah, it's stupid and takes away from all lingering questions and possibilities. He was made to have his delusions by them. He had his normalcy and stability taken away by them, and of course they are in the wrong, and of course he is in the right when he sicks Saya on them like a JoJo stand. The price of this, of course, is that it's so much less effective. Josh has done basically nothing wrong and he's had everything taken from him. He isn't a bad guy, so feeling sympathetic for him doesn't stand out at all. It's easy, it's expected. The VN's Fuminori, meanwhile, is an abject bastard, so it's really powerful when, through his miserable monologue, you start to feel for him. He's got it rough, and because he only started becoming so misanthropic after his agnosia arose, you don't want to blame him for it. It's not his fault that the world is so revolting to him. Actually, that's a point. Something really quite integral to how the original story works that is missed in the comic is the level and frequency of delusion experienced by the protagonist. Fuminori suffers from agnosia, a chronic condition affecting him at all times, directly affecting the way his brain interprets the signals coming from his senses. This first affects his vision, but spreads to his other senses as his brain believes the intense visual stimuli. Side note, there is a real condition called visual agnosia, but it doesn't have much in common with the game's version of it. It doesn't literally twist your vision like this. To my understanding, it's more like an impairment in the ability to recognize and identify visual stimuli. Subtypes include things like face blindness. Expecting a monster horror game kind of thing to adhere to actual medical facts is a little silly, like obviously that's not what you're here for. The main thing is, Fuminori experiences this hellscape constantly, and with a rigid consistency to how his brain will twist the world around him, always interpreting a given stimulus the same way. His world is broken, but predictably so. As a result, he's broken, worn down, going through the motions and acting out the bare minimum life in order to appear normal from the outside, strategically spending as little time in the real world as possible, instead opting to live his life in his happy place, with Saya. The once beautiful colors of the real world are pasted over with a sickening green to soothe him. Here, he becomes totally dependent on Saya, her pure, unconditional love dragging him further away from the real world. A vicious cycle that turns him colder, more resentful, and just plain more detached from the real world. In contrast, the comic presents Josh's delusions as more unpredictable. He actually sees the world normally a decent amount of the time, so instead of a constant and consistently grim world, he instead deals with episodes of delusions of varying intensity and subject. As you can imagine, this changes the general feeling of the story and the protagonist's character quite significantly. Josh's behavior is less moody and antagonistic, and more paranoid. The fear of his next episode is constantly looming over him, and he hides away from other people at the first sign of anything being off. He doesn't get to be like Fuminori, reacting to the twisted world with deadpan resignation, because he never knows what he's going to see and when. That said, he copes pretty well most of the time. Josh holds a conversation with people other than Saya quite well, even up to the climax of the story. This does mean you get to see a range of different visuals for his delusion sequences, which are cool, but it's lacking that cold consistency of Fuminori's world. His affliction is clearly something different. I don't think agnosia is even mentioned by name in the comic. In fact, as it's revealed in the third issue, Josh's delusions don't even come from his mind. They come from Saya. Yes, while Fuminori gets reclusive as a result of spending time around Saya and experiencing a sort of human connection with her he can no longer get from anyone else, Josh's hallucinations are literally caused by his proximity to Saya. She emits radiation poisoning that directly affects the brains of those who spend time around her, letting them see into other worlds. I think that's what it's saying at least, but that would mean everything Josh sees is kinda real. And just like that, the story loses all meaning. The original has this theme of madness. It asks, what is madness really? Is Fuminori to blame for his actions? It's genuinely scary to think about, this idea that your brain could just be broken, and that the mostly reasonable reactions you might have to it could make you an outcast, even a monster. But anyway, instead of those horrible questions fed by the creeping feeling of possibility, Josh's visions in the comic are instead a real alternate reality he tunes into like a radio, with the help of sci-fi waves. It's not about madness anymore, it's not about bad luck giving him exactly the right mental conditions to see people as gore monsters and gore monsters as people. It's just standard fantasy sci-fi powers given to him deliberately by crazy scientists who have done the procedure on many other people. He's not alone, he's barely isolated, he's still a victim, yes, but just a victim of laughably evil bad guys rather than the whims of an uncaring universe. What if your brain actively worked against you and made your life misery, making you lose your humanity? It's just inherently scarier and more believable than, what if a bad guy was bad? And I'm not saying there isn't a place for schlocky sci-fi conspiracy, I just don't think it's here. The comic also adds that Saya's human appearance is just a natural feature of her when observed by someone, to this same concept of her just emitting stuff that makes you see differently. I have several issues with this. Visual novel Saya has an innocence about her. She doesn't mean to be a monster, she just has this kind of animalistic, programmed nature to her, but inside I think she wants to be more than that. She has agency. She's able to fall in love with Fuminori because, by chance, he sees her as beautiful. This unlovable creature learning what it means to love and be loved. In the comic, she honestly comes across as more directly manipulative, love not really coming into it. She says it does, but it feels flat and fake. I suspect that's not the intention, but that really is how it comes across with the lack of depth here. It's unearned. This also means you don't really get the nature versus nurture themes with her. She isn't in conflict over her biological purpose, and I get that this is probably cut for runtime reasons, and because the nature of her purpose in the visual novel is almost definitely a bit much for an American comic adaptation. But then why adapt a story with this kind of content and theming in the first place? And thinking about it, it's not like the comic shies away from this kind of thing per se. The climax of the first issue was a sex scene, so if anything, I think going all the way with this pretty important aspect of the story would have actually made the sex serve a purpose and be less gratuitous. Because as it is, the end of the first issue is basically purely for the shock value of Saya's reveal. It's honestly juvenile. I can kinda see what it is in the visual novel that gave them this radiation idea for the comic. VN Saya is able to modify and manipulate the biological structures in people and animals to some extent, experimenting on and altering people, both their bodies and their minds. But in the visual novel, this is unrelated to the affliction Fuminori is suffering from. Saya isn't the cause, and actually might be his only way out of this personal hell. But more on that in a moment. The other issue with her human form in the comic is what it does for Josh's character. So, in the visual novel, the way Fuminori sees things with his condition isn't random. Instead, it's like different visuals have been swapped around for him, usually mundane things switched with gory things. So if he sees, say, normal human food as a disgusting mess of body parts, then he sees an actual mess of body parts as a kind of perfect food. This same logic applies to people. He sees humans as these corrupted, unholy monsters, so therefore what we would think as a monster appears to him as a perfect, innocent being. Saya is Fuminori's image of purity. Already this gets a little lost in the comic. The image the comic Saya puts out still seems to be specific to the person seeing her, but it's projected from her rather than coming from within Josh, so it doesn't feel the same. The girl he sees isn't his brain's conjuration of purity, a guiding light leading him astray anymore. And with him already being less isolated due to his visions being less consistent, he doesn't feel that same pull to follow her into her debased world. It is kinda suggested that Saya looks different to everybody in the comic, but no reason is given, so maybe that's their way of suggesting it's like a personalized look based on Josh's perception of her, but I still don't like that it comes from her rather than him. In the VN, I feel that Saya's human form representing Fuminori's vision of purity reveals the darkness within him, especially considering the kind of relationship they have. He is pretty fucked up for this, Jesus. And yet the writing wraps you around its little finger and tries to make him sympathetic anyway. It's not his fault that his brain is broken and he sees her this way. Hell, none of what happened to him is his fault. What is his fault are the things he does on his descent into inhumanity. Though, you have a choice, you know. At roughly the midpoint of the game, you are faced with two options. People are dead. Fuminori has even unwittingly helped eat one of them. He is pretty conclusively going past the point of no return when Saya makes a proposal to him. She can fix him. After experimenting on other humans, she thinks she's identified what exactly is wrong with Fuminori's brain, and she knows how to rewire him, to make him see the world as normal once again, to free him from madness and let him attempt to reconnect with the real world once more. The caveat is it would mean he would no longer be able to look at Saya and see her as human. His feelings would persist, but Saya can't allow herself to be seen by him in her actual form. Choosing that life would mean abandoning her. I see Saya as a pretty tragic character for how she clearly possesses intelligence of a human level, if not more, and wants to be more than her biological instincts. She wants to love and be loved, to be an emotional, even intellectual being, even deciding on a gender to match what she sees as her biological role to what she understands about human society. But the only reason she's able to find this love in Fuminori is because of his condition, which, either by a stroke of luck or a cruel twist of fate, allows him to validate her. He sees her just as she wants to be seen. Beautiful. Imagine if her human form wasn't a chance product of the protagonist's mind and was instead something she specifically broadcast out to him. Imagine how much less impact this would all have. But this isn't Fuminori's choice to make, it's yours. Normally for a visual novel this wouldn't be such a big deal. A story that branches based on player choices is a common aspect for probably most games in the medium, but here it's a little different. Song of Saya is an incredibly linear game, with this being one of only two choices in its entire 5-hour runtime, the other being right at the end, so they stand out as key moments, directly involving the player and the narrative for effect. These choices are similar in that they kinda ask you if you want to quit while you're ahead, or if you want to delve deeper into the abyss, that you're willing to learn knowledge no mortal should. It's a really neat way to involve the player directly in these eldritch themes, effectively mirroring Koji's character in the final act of the story, as he chooses to get involved with Fuminori and Saya to put a stop to them, even if it means destroying his own psyche. As humans, we just can't help but stare into the void. It's our irrational compulsion. With this first choice, letting Saya fix Fuminori leads to a very emotional, bittersweet ending where he's imprisoned for murder and never sees Saya again. The pair never stop loving each other, but Saya knows that Fuminori wouldn't be able to bear to look at her with human eyes. They meet one last time before parting, sat on opposite sides of a jail door. Saya's last words to him spoken through a tapped-out message on a cell phone, knowing that even her voice would sound nauseating to him. She says goodbye. And so I wait. Dreaming of her face and her voice, I wait, forever in my white world. A beautiful song performed by Kanako Ito scores the credit roll on what might be the best possible outcome. People may be dead, but in the grand scheme of things, not that many. Fuminori is imprisoned for life, barely escaping death row on grounds of insanity, cursed to go on living with the faintest, simple hope of someday seeing Saya again. It's an unpleasant fate for him, but for the world, it's for the best. But the game really leads you on to not choose this path. It wants you to continue. Even if you chose that ending first, it knows you will be back. You're led to pick the right option that extends the madness and gets more people hurt because it means staying with Saya in her moment of need, and it's obviously the game's critical path. You want to see where this rabbit hole goes. Everything that happens after this point was enabled by you. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to be talking about a crappy comic. I got carried away talking about something I actually like there, I can't help it. Obviously, I'm not going to fault the comic for not being interactive like this, but there are a lot of little missing things like this. So, Saya and her human form. I've kind of been avoiding the elephant in the room with her design, but like, look at her. I guess to start with, I don't blame the comic creators for redesigning Saya to age her up. It's a reasonable decision and I totally understand why they did so. The relationship she and Fuminori have is, considering her childlike body, not something most creators probably want to even touch, and definitely would not have gone down well. It is really fucking uncomfortable what happens between the characters when one of them looks like this, but it's gotta be said, it's pretty apparent that that's the point. Take a fun look at a crappy comic, keep it light for the first video. Oh well. Their relationship is upsetting and disturbing, and the VN story exploits this with purpose to fuck with you when it lays Fuminori's thought process out for you in horribly sympathetic detail. If we look at him from the perspective of any other person, he is clearly nothing more than a monster. And the final act of the game spends a lot of time in the viewpoint of Koji, grappling with what his former friend has become and determined to put a stop to him, whatever it takes. The switch to Koji's perspective is like a revealing light, exposing what Fuminori really is. Until this point, we really only get Fuminori's side of the story, his justifications, his appeals to our sympathy. With his condition, his rapidly declining mental state makes him dependent on Saya. He admits he wouldn't be able to go on living without her. This contradiction, this manipulation that makes us see this monster of a man as a sympathetic, suffering person is key to how the whole story works. It's a story of contradictions, duality, seen too in how we come to realize that Saya, a proper science fiction capital M monster, is a sapient, sentimental soul who deserves the world. No, not like that. There's a subtle theme of, I guess, self-actualization with her, how she learned about human life through books, being a kind of infovore, or maybe just naturally curious, and decides she wants this life of simple humanity. I don't know, this stuff makes her a really interesting character to me. It's really interesting how she falls in love with Fuminori basically because he just happens to see her in an affirming way. The point is, this central theme of the whole story, the contradiction in Fuminori's morality and his narration, and the duality of it all, is not successfully replicated in the comic to any degree. They do try to introduce the protagonist's instability and violence toward the end, but it's too little too late. I just found Josh too reasonable, and for lack of a better word, likable, up to this point. The cartoonishly evil cabal of mad scientists conspiring against him and countless other victims of the surgery put him squarely in the right. So when he finally starts to lose it at the end and starts getting tired to kill people, it just feels like, yeah, he's been through some shit from these guys, let him have this. The people he kills in this version aren't innocent, they're straight up maniacal bad guys, so it's very hard to feel anything towards this. Anything other than bewilderment that they're showing me Saya's real body during all of this. They even start to touch on the good stuff with the flower imagery towards the end, but again, it's too little too late. It doesn't really say anything with it, and besides, it's missing all of the actual textual comparison of Saya's life to that of a dandelion, so seeing her bloom doesn't really mean anything. Without a morally bankrupt, monstrous protagonist, the story is totally stripped of its core thesis. There isn't anything to replace it with either, and to be clear, I think an adaptation that changes core elements can work, and even stand on its own, as long as it's aware of its medium and makes decisions that serve this. But the key word there is change. You can't just remove things and have nothing take their place. This and so many other issues of different scales add up to a comic devoid of substance and purpose. Which really begs the question, if they weren't even going to attempt to tackle the game's themes, why and how was this comic made? The actual specifics of how the comic got authorized and made is a little unclear, more on that in a bit, but the thought process of the writers Daniel Liatovich and Todd Ockwerk is nicely laid out in an interview with Bloody Disgusting published before the release of the final issue. As this was published during the comics run, it's of course going to be a publicity interview and will skew to general positivity, but with that in mind, let's have a little look. The way they talk about the story, to me, suggests they actually did understand the assignment. They immediately identify the high amount of objectionable content in the VN, and express doubt about being able to convey the original intent and message with all of the changes they'd have to make it publisher and reader friendly. Liatovich says,
"We've always written horror, but the original visual novel went to places that US projects dutifully avoid. At first, I wasn't sure what would remain if we eliminated all that stuff. Todd kept pushing for us to try, and finally, I had an epiphany. It's an allegory about how far we'd go for love, for that one person who no one else may approve of. We've all had one of those. If we managed to grow all the horror out of that relationship, we might be onto something."
This is exactly what I've been wanting to see. Awareness of the realities of adaptation, the change in medium, the change in audience, and the willingness to reinterpret the story to make it work in its new form. This honestly really does endear me to the writers. They didn't set out to make something bad, nobody does. It's just a shame how the final product came out, especially as they seem familiar with the works of Lovecraft that inspired it and the nihilistic worldview that drives the feeling of isolation, and the whole idea of forces too much for the human mind to comprehend that defy our human values of good and bad and narrow definition of reality. They know all of this, so why isn't it present in the comic? Nitro Plus, the game's original developer and publisher, seemed to get it too, allowing the writers to change things up to make it fit the comic medium as long as the central love between the protagonist and Saya were present. Apparently Nitro Plus were very pleased with the American version of their creation. It's kind of funny to mention Nitro Plus's approval of the comic in an interview that also subtly recommends a fan translation patch for the game. They say that an English patch is available, which, when this interview was conducted in 2010, would have had to have been the 2009 patch by TL Wiki. There wouldn't be an official English release until 2013, when Just USA got the license and officially published that same translation. I'm sure Nitro Plus were delighted to see this in an official publicity interview. And I mean, I know that use of a fan patch doesn't necessarily imply piracy, like you can buy a Japanese copy and apply the patch to it, and probably have to fiddle with a locale emulator too, but I think it's fair to say that maybe not everybody did it legitimately. But that touches on something interesting. Neither of the writers read Japanese, and if the official English version we have today is adapted from a fan translation that hadn't been released when they were writing, then were they working from officially translated materials that we haven't seen? Well, as Ockwerk reveals, not exactly.
In the beginning, the hardest part was the fact it was all in Japanese with no English translation. Thankfully, my wife Yuriko was willing to go through the whole thing and translate it for us.
So for some reason, Nitro Plus expected these English-speaking writers to create their adaptation without being provided an English version of the text they were adapting. What exactly was the plan here? If one of the writers didn't happen to have a Japanese-speaking family member who I guess would happily work for free translating this thing, what then? Were they expected to just make it up? It sounds like Nitro Plus did care about the adaptation, so were they just woefully unaware of how to organize such a project, or were they expecting the English side to hire translators at their own expense? I really don't know. And that's not even to mention the obvious issues of deferring this important task to a family member rather than a translator hired for the task. It's not long by visual novel standards, about 150,000 characters, but it's still quite an undertaking, especially as we don't even know if Yuriko is a professional translator. Either way, having to translate this whole-ass visual novel full of objectionable content in your spare time when your husband's job is relying on you getting it done quickly, it's not the ideal conditions for good work. Like, just imagine being in that situation. For those reasons, I kinda doubt that the writers got a full translated script of the game. When Ogverk says Yuriko went through the whole thing and translated it, that could easily be a figure of speech. The general fan consensus is that the writers were working with the gist of the story, which would explain the loose grasp of the original story displayed in the comic. For example, they talk about the changes to the main characters, that Josh needs to be more of a proactive character than Fuminori due to the demands of the change in medium, that a comic doesn't work as well with a reactive character as a visual novel does. Which, while I may not agree with what this does for the story, it is one of those tricky aspects of retelling a story in a medium with different expectations. What definitely isn't so understandable is their justification for one of my biggest issues with the comic, the way that Josh is definitively the hero of the story. On the idea of sympathy, Liatovich says that
both characters had to remain likeable enough for the big payoff at the end to really hit home.
To me, this just feels like a total misunderstanding of what is effective about the characters. What makes the VN stories and ending so effective is that it evokes sympathy despite the total unlikability of the pair, especially Fuminori. Seeing Saya bloom into something beautiful, the whole world being changed in Fuminori's favor, is powerful because the catharsis of seeing their love win conflicts strongly with the feelings of disgust toward him. This contrast, the gap, the complete lack of likability is what makes it so effective. With the misunderstanding of general tone, it almost does feel like they were adapting from a description of the story rather than the text itself. Another very questionable decision that gets explained here is why their version of the story overly explains its mechanics. You know, that other big problem I had with it. Ogverk explains that this is down to a cultural difference on expectations of media, saying that ambiguous and dreamlike with no explanation necessary doesn't go down so well in America, and that rules must be established and followed consistently. He even goes so far as to acknowledge that this surreal nature is part of what makes the VN effective, even mentioning the in medias res beginning making you accept the way things are for Fuminori. Seeing it spelled out like this by one of the writers, it does feel like they almost got it. They knew that some of these changes were detracting from what works about the story, lamenting them even, but ultimately conceding that it's the nature of adapting for a different audience. It really does sound like a tough job. Still, it's frustrating considering that they highlight a goal of the comic was to bridge the gap between fans of different media, as they found that fans of American comics and fans of Japanese media like manga didn't often read the other. I really respect this, and I think getting people to read things outside of their normal interests is a good thing, especially when it means more weird art. It's good to have a range of influences. If you were just to consume a narrow range of the same stuff, your own work won't be as broad and well-rounded. They wanted to create something that would appeal to both, admitting they were walking a fine line between not alienating existing fans and not being too out there and grotesque for new fans. Of course, this is an important thing to consider with any adaptation, as it will inevitably be many people's first experience with the story, especially a cross-language one like this. It's just that in this case, I feel the end result is the worst of both worlds, not really suitable for anybody. It all brings us back to that fundamental question of why was the comic made, but the end of the interview gives us a bit of a clue.
There will be a definite push for Song of Fire to venture to the silver screen, a transition we're extremely excited about.
This is in response to being asked about upcoming projects from the writers, and so the phrasing feels a little ambiguous, like the context of the question makes it sound like this movie push is coming from the comic writers, but everything else, like the existence of the comic itself, feels as though Nitro Plus was making a conscious push into America. As they're the rights holders, it definitely makes the most sense that they were the ones trying to expand and turn it into a media franchise, rather than the comic writers. It would explain their apparent enthusiasm for the comic adaptation and willingness to get it off the ground, as if they had lofty goals further along the line of getting a movie made. It kind of makes sense that they would be willing to work with an American company and let them make changes, all in the pursuit of more assured popularity and success. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that that success never came, and as far as I can tell, this movie was never more than a pipe dream. At least as far as I can tell, anyway. If you know any more, please let me know. I'm really interested to know if this ever went anywhere.
I hope those who read Song of Fire enjoy it. If you're a fan of the game and quick to write off the comic, I hope you at least read the whole thing before tearing it apart.
Well, at least I gave it a fair shot. Before doing research for this, I had thought many, if not most, English language adaptations of Japanese media, or at least the relatively early ones, like up until around the 90s or mid-2000s, were the work of American companies looking for stuff to license. I probably got that impression because of companies like 4Kids and the US anime boom. But no, quite a few of these actually came from the Japanese creators or license holders wanting to expand into new markets. For example, Sailor Moon's US dub was the product of Bandai and Toei wanting to reach new audiences. Even the now infamous Total remake that was lost media for the longest time was a proof of concept for their first attempt at this. Or Bandai again, bringing Gundam to America, trying a few times unsuccessfully with stuff like the 0079 movie trilogy before they hit it big with Gundam Wing. Of course, there were some cases of media that were specifically licensed for distribution by Western companies, whether they meant to or not, like the aforementioned 4Kids stuff, but the more I look into it, a lot that I had assumed were like this were actually kind of two-way deals, like much of Saban Entertainment's releases, and heck, even Funimation starting up and eventually licensing Dragon Ball Z was suggested by a producer at Toei. Not Dragon Ball Evolution though, that's Fox's fault. It's worth pointing out that a lot of these are specifically kids media, which Saya certainly is not. Whether this is bias in what's documented and well known in the West, I'm not sure. Though just off the top of my head, it certainly feels as though the majority of Japanese media that have successfully come to the West are kid-oriented. I guess at the end of the day, Nitro Plus had these lofty ambitions, and, total speculation on my part, perhaps they saw the US anime boom and thinking they could use it, greatly underestimated what it would take to conquer the global market, not realizing which kinds of Japanese media were getting popular. Not so much niche stuff, and definitely not gory sexual visual novels. So in conclusion, yeah, I basically used the comic as an excuse to talk about how cool the game is. I don't like to be negative, so my main goal was to be positive about something, while also talking about this weird little curiosity and what does and doesn't work about this unusual version of one of my favorite stories. I also know I'm not an expert. I know there's this effect online where people assume that if you're talking about something in a YouTube video, then that means you know every little thing about it, but no, I'm always learning. I'm just someone who thinks a lot about the themes of the things I like, and I just want to share and gush about it all. In fact, this was supposed to be a much shorter video, but there ended up being so much to talk about. Oops. It's also gotta be said that as a work of art, you're free to interpret the game's story how you like. I know my reading of it is pretty harsh on Fuminori and his abhorrent actions, but I'm by no means suggesting that's the only way to see things. He's not a cartoon villain, and he certainly has his reasons for the way he is. That disconnect between his brain and body that I'm sure we can all relate to some degree. It's a theme that I find really interesting to explore, and I think this kind of weird, even transgressive art needs to be appreciated and celebrated, perhaps now more than ever, with corporations and governments around the world enforcing their puritanical views on people, placing bans and restrictions on things they decide are icky, standing in the way of willing adults interacting with whatever art they feel like. Anyway, Saya did nothing wrong. She's not a cannibal, she only eats different species to her.